The next speaker is actually here from the Faculty of Medicine at Lund University, Viveka L Åhlander. And she has, I had to have this paper because I couldn't remember what's her, what it is in English. She's a speech pathologist.
Speech-language pathologist.
Speech-language pathologist. And she has been working, for one thing, with Kerstin, I know, and she took an interest in these preschool teachers' voices. What does it do to them? But the interesting thing is that she also broadened her research and now looks at this environment on a more holistic view. We already heard from several of the speakers that we need a holistic view. We need to take several factors into account, and I think this is going to be so interesting to listen to you.
Thank you. Just start my clock as well here. Well, I'm not going to stay at preschool or daycare centers. We're moving into the classroom right now and to talk about children who are about 8 years old. What I have been doing together with my group is a number of studies by now covering the effect of the speaker on the children and the effect also of noise on the children. I won't be able to answer the cliffhanger that Kerstin gave me, that is, if the behavior that is perhaps established during preschool, if that goes on when they are older. We don't know that, but we see it. Anyway, we'd like to put forward that the classroom is to be indeed a shared environment. It's not, I mean, when we talk about sound amplification, acoustical treatment, and background noise, all those factors within the classroom, we normally think about and aim at the children. But we like to also include the teacher, as Eja said earlier, because there are two communicating parties here. And I can use this one. What we want to happen in the classroom is this. We want comprehension to happen. We want motivation. We want learning. And for this, we have factors that are intrinsic to the child, which are internal to the child, and we also have the interaction with external factors. Within the child, we have factors such as working memory, long-term memory, executive functions. Those are the cognitive factors that we have been talking about, touched upon earlier today as well. I would think so, at least. And then hearing, of course, language and social skills, world knowledge, things that you learn at home, quality of input, attitudes, and so on. And then we have the factors that are external to the child and that are also shared with the teacher to some extent. And here we have room acoustics, we have light, temperature, air quality, and such things. We also have the teacher's communication, that is eye contact, gaze, gestures, well, all that we count as non-verbal communication. And then we have technical devices helping us or perhaps not helping us. Hearing aids, both for children and for the grown-ups in the classroom. And then we have noise. And also the relations within the classroom, but we are not going to talk about them today. I'd like to start about talking about adverse listening conditions. What is that? Well, Sven Mattis in 2012 have written a brilliant paper on classification of adverse listening conditions. And we have, for one, the degradation at the source. That would be what happens to the teacher, having a hoarse voice perhaps, or dysphonic, which I'm going to use as a term here. An accent that is different. A different pace or speed, perhaps disfluencies, stammering. We also have a different language or maybe a complicated dialect, which might be the case in this region. I don't know. And then we have the degradation that happens during transmission, and that would be noise. And that would also be the effect of the room acoustics. And then we have the limitations at the receiving end, so to say, within the listener. That would be hearing problems and cognitive problems, perhaps, and also language, which wouldn't be a problem. But if you speak a different language as opposed to the person who talks to you, then it might be a problem. So there we have our adverse listening conditions. And to start with noise, as we have been talking about for a while here. We know that noise affects memory and recall. There is, as previous speakers have talked about as well, there is a number of studies by now, mostly performed in adults and in normal hearing persons. But we know from studies by Staffan Hygge and even more authors that noise affects memory and recall. That even if you can repeat what you heard when it was told to you in noise, you will remember it more poorly if you heard it in noise than as if you heard it in silence. So something happens in noise. And I'd like to take a short detour around learning here, because that comes into the picture here as well. This is not new knowledge to most of you probably, but I'd like to just touch upon it anyway. To consider knowledge as a web of knowledge. What happens when a new item comes into this web is that either you need to alter the web or you need to expand it in a way. And what happens when noise comes into as a disturbance, then you need to be able to both grapple and memorize the item that is going to be integrated into the web, and you also need to be able to process it on the same time. This is rather complicated and quite demanding for your working memory. And what can happen is that if it's too noisy, you just lose the item that was going to go into the web. That's a very short and easy way to put it, something rather complicated. But anyhow, I'd also like to introduce the concept of speaker's comfort, which we define as the subjective impression that speakers have when they feel that the vocal message reaches the listener effectively with no or low vocal effort. And for this, we need the support from the room or from an amplification system. We need something that helps the speaker have their voice carrying it out. And we also need a good speech intelligibility. We need for the speaker to see and perceive that the message reaches the listeners. And we also need a functioning sensory motor feedback from the phonatory apparatus, that is, some people call it the voice box. We need to have some kind of feedback that, I don't strain, it doesn't hurt, and so on and so on. And this affects teachers. I'd just like to give you an example of what it sounds like when you talk over noise. This is a person who describes a map, a fictive map in Swedish, and the first recording is of her in silence, and then in noise comparable to daycare assembly, about 70 dB. And this is what it sounds like. Oops.
Runda det går österut, runt det, svänger rakt norrut till Adventure Playground. Det är en sån här aktivitetsbana. Vi tittar lite på den, går förbi den, går sen rakt österut, en lång bit ut för att sen ge oss norrut till Granitbergen.
And then we have noise.
Då ska jag berätta om en karta här. Och vi utgår ifrån Diamantgruvan, går vidare österut förbi kyrkogården och sen...
Perhaps we just cut her short there, I think. But this is not something extreme, not anything extreme. This is what happens when you talk over noise. You try, as Kerstin said earlier, you need to try to make yourself heard. And that is what you do. So this is really a degradation at the source that you heard here. So our question in our research group was, does the teacher's voice affect students' comprehension? Well, We know from earlier studies that about 13% of the teachers suffers from ongoing voice problems. If you put the question in another way, you would have a larger percentage. But every day, about 13% of the teachers suffer from voice problems, and that is quite a lot. Our research questions put to both normal hearing children and hearing impaired children were, does a dysphonic voice, that is a hoarse voice, affect the results in a language comprehension test? In silence and in bubble noise, does it affect listening effort, measured as response times and perceived effort? Is performance and effort associated with cognitive capacities, such as working memory and executive functions? And how do children assess a dysphonic voice? We have by now investigated about a bit more than 300 children, both normally hearing and children with hearing impairments. And we started before the children were submitted to the tests or to the language tests that we used. We tested their cognitive capacities. Firstly, we tested their executive functions, which would be the system that monitors your behavior to helps you inhibit incoming signals and disturbances and so on. And we tested working memory capacity, as I told you before. And we have mainly focused on two aspects in our studies. We have focused on performance and on effort. We had tested this with two kinds of language comprehension tests. The first one, a sentence-based test, where the child listens to a sentence and then is supposed to select the correct picture. And one group listened to sentences sounding like this.
Farbrorn men inte hästen hoppar.
And the other group like this.
Farbrorn men inte hästen hoppar.
And to move a bit closer to what would be considered a normal classroom, so to say, we used passage comprehension for the later studies that we have performed. That is short stories with a follow-up question. And then again, the children listened to a typical voice and a dysphonic voice. But in this set of studies, we compared each child to him or herself. And we, as I said, assessed performance. The children assessed the voices as well on an emoticon scale, such as the one you see here. They assessed how they felt when they listened to the voices and what the teacher was like. And we also rated listening effort both through response times, as I said earlier, and that we did from the ending of the question that they heard until when they clicked the mouse to select the correct or the matching picture, and through perceived effort, which the children rated themselves on a scale such as the one you see here. What we could say from the studies, the sentence-based studies, were that we had no kind of clear-cut overall effect from the voice quality on the sentence-based results, but what we saw that the children in the dysphonic group, the ones listening to the hoarse teacher, they were less accurate on more complex items, and they were more uncertain on easier items. So here the item complexity comes into play as well. It has something to do with this. We also saw that the cognitive factors were associated to how they responded, and we also saw that if you had stronger working memory capacity, you also reached better results. You scored higher on the performance. And these are just recently published data on passage comprehension, the short stories. And what you see here in this figure, you see the scores on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you have the listening conditions. That is typical voice in quiet, dysphonic voice in quiet, typical in noise, and dysphonic in noise. And this is in hearing impaired children and children with cochlear implants. And not very many, but the trend says the same in other studies as well. And what you can see here is that the voice doesn't seem really to give a result. Where's the pointer? Gone. Oh, there it is. But something happens here, as you see. when they are exposed to noise, then their performance really dips. But we also had the cognitive capacities in co-play here. So the ones with higher executive functions this time responded better in with the typical voice than in the dysphonic voice. The result from the response times, which would be then an kind of objective measurements of listening effort, how effortful it was to listen. We had a quite surprising result here, that the girls were the ones emerging to be slower when they listened to the dysphonic voice. They took longer time to find and collect the correct answer. And we don't know what this mirrors. It might mirror maturity, a gender-based difference, or it might mirror strategies. That is kind of motivation. How motivated are you to actually solve the task? We don't know, and we keep working with that. And when we look at the children's rating of the effort that they needed in different listening conditions, when they listened to both voices in the short stories, we can see that there were clear differences. And here you have, it's a bit expanded here, as you see, it's typical voice in quiet, and then we have added babble noise from one competing speaker or 4 competing speakers. And then we have the dysphonic voice in quiet with 1 competing speaker and 4 competing speakers. And as you can see, there was not much of a difference between 1 or 4 competing speakers, but there is clearly a significant difference between the typical voice in quiet and the dysphonic voice in quiet. So here we really can say that it's more effortful to listen to a dysphonic voice, even though it might not be related to your performance, but anyhow, it's much more effortful. And here again, the cognitive capacities come into play, because we also saw that the children needed their executive functions to work with this. The attitudes. Children in the typical voice group were significantly more positive, and that relates again to the effort. It was easier for them to listen. They also thought that the typical voice was she sounded more nice, and she was cute and a nice person all over, and they didn't see her. And the dysphonic voice, they considered her being stern and not so very nice and having some economical problems. I don't know where they got that from, but that was what they thought. 8-year-olds, mind you. And to sum up, the dysphonic voice seemed to have a similar but smaller effect compared to babble noise, but there still is an effect. It decreases accuracy, it decreases certainty as well. They got more, unsecure. It increases effort, both measured as speed and also their self-assessed effort. It increased their negative attitudes, and it definitely taxes cognitive capacities as well. So my general conclusion here is that the voice quality plays a role for children's performance and experience, more directly for normal hearing children, but affects effort in all. And noise is a more powerful source of disturbance in children with hearing impairment, and children with hearing impairment are heavily depending on their cognitive capacities. We can also say that classroom noise, direct, indirect, or compiled effects of noise affects the teacher's speaker comfort, is detrimental to children, especially the more vulnerable ones. That would be the children with hearing impairments. We haven't looked into children with like autism spectrum disorders and so on, but that is a remaining research question. But we can also say that children risk exclusion from learning if we have this situation in the classrooms that we have today. And we need to talk about voice. And why? Well, because we need to put the teacher into the communication chain in the classroom. No one would ever dream of designing a concert hall, for example, without thinking about that someone should stand here and and do something that affects the audience. But we do that when we talk about classrooms. And I leave you with that and with the team around these studies called Voice and Noise Group. And thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Viveka. This is so interesting, but we don't have so much time. We can have one very short question, if we have one. Okay.
I was just thinking about if the children has a near relation to the person who is talking. Have you?
We haven't investigated that. I mean, but these are mainly experimental studies. We are just now moving into the real classroom, so we haven't really looked into it yet. We don't know, but we suspect that you get used to hearing the voice, and then it's easier, probably. But we don't know. That's just a guess. Maybe an educated one, but I don't know.
Thank you so much.
Okay.